Wayne, are you okay with starting, and then as if more people pop in, just as they come in, are you okay with just people just popping in?
Sure, that's fine.
All right. I guess we'll just ask everyone who's on if they could just turn your microphone off, please. Don't have to take your camera off if you don't want to, but certainly turn yourself mute yourself if you can, please. I'll do the same.
Okay, I guess I'll start then. This Heritage Committee orientation session, and it's specifically tailored for the town of Innisfil. I'd like to start by thanking the town, and in particular Kevin, for arranging the opportunity to present this orientation session. And I'd like to speak just very briefly about Community Heritage Ontario. It's the Association of Municipal Heritage Committees, and our objective is to promote good heritage conservation practice among municipal heritage committees. Throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm just going to say MHCs rather than municipal heritage committees to cut down on the verbiage. We are all volunteers. So we're doing this because we believe strongly in heritage conservation. Our annual conference this year is in London. It's June 15th to 17th, and I encourage you to attend. There's still an opportunity to come to register. You'll get a chance to learn from other municipalities what the effect of the recent Ontario Heritage Act amendments are, and to talk to heritage professionals, advocates, and MHC members. And on the right-hand side, you see our latest newsletter that we publish 4 times a year and make it available to our membership. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to renew your membership in CHO. So who am I? I'm Wayne Morgan. I've had 40 years experience in heritage conservation. I've worn many hats over those years. I was chair of a municipal, I was a chair of an MHC for 20 years in Newmarket. I owned a designated property, and you can see it on the bottom there. My wife and I restored and renovated the Robert Simpson House in Newmarket. I am a community planner. I'm a retired community planner. I was the senior coordinator of heritage preservation services in the city of Toronto. And you can see a couple of the projects that I worked on while I was there, including the Distillery District, the largest collection of 19th century industrial buildings in Canada. And I secured 4 heritage conservation districts, including the Yorkville HCD. I have been a consultant since I retired from the city in 2006, and I just recently retired from that. So I am a retired registered professional planner and a member of the Canadian Association of the Heritage Professionals. And I'm president for 1 more month of Community Heritage Ontario. I will be retiring from that position. So you can interrupt me. Questions are welcome. I will not spare you, but keep in mind, it could lengthen the session, and we have a lot to cover in the session. You will get a copy of the presentation. So Kevin has mentioned he's recording it. I'm also converting this into a PDF, so you can print off a copy if you want. And the objective is to assist new MHC members, as a refresher for existing MHC members, and all members in understanding recent Ontario Heritage Act changes. And there were changes made at the beginning of 2002 and at the beginning of this year. Some of the takeaways: your role as an MHC is important. There are many tools that you can use to protect heritage. Each tool has strict process requirements, and that is important because a lawyer can easily hang you up if you don't follow the process requirements set out in the Ontario Heritage Act. You need to work with your council and staff. And finally, I believe heritage conservation can be satisfying and rewarding. So the scope of the session is a brief background. There's a discussion of the role of the MHC. We'll define heritage, and we'll talk briefly about council and staff relations. We'll talk about outreach and education, research, how to research a property for potential listing or designation, and then how you go about listing a property in the register, individual property designation, which is often referred to as Part 4, and Part 4 is Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And we'll look at designation, alteration, and demolition, amending and repeal of designation. Part 5, which is district designation, so we'll deal with the actual designation process and alteration and demolition. Heritage easement agreements, heritage property standards, and grants and tax incentives. So a lot to cover during this time. And so keep in mind, you don't have to write everything down. You will get a copy of what is presented. So welcome to Heritage Conservation. If you're new, it began when many people lost their heads. And this is the French Revolution. And it was the start of thinking about conserving heritage, in this case, buildings and properties. And it was realized that even though they were executing the aristocracy and they wanted to get rid of them, in fact, there were a number of buildings that they felt were saving, not just because of the aristocrats that lived in them, but the workers who designed them, the builders who built them, the architects, and masons, roofers, woodworkers. So there were many heritage values embodied in a property. So there was a realization that we don't want to get rid of these simply because they belong to the aristocrats, but they represent something important about the nation. In Canada, it began in the 1870s when there was a movement to get rid of the wall around Quebec City and the defense installations there. And the Governor General, Lord Dufferin at the time, said, no, I think this is a valuable heritage resource. So it's as a result of the intervention of Lord Dufferin that we still have a walled city in Canada. So this was the start of thoughts about preserving heritage structures, heritage properties for their values. And just for your information, there was once a wall around the city of Montreal, but it was demolished prior to the demolition of Quebec City's wall. So you're now a member of Municipal Heritage Committee. What is your role? To advise council on property-based heritage conservation matters. And the Ontario Heritage Act has specific requirements for council to consult with its MHC. And specifically, it has to consult with its MHC whenever it lists a property in the register, whenever council expresses its intent to designate a property, an individual property, so that's Part 4, when it's council's intent to amend or repeal a designation, again, Part 4, for a proposed alteration of a designated property. So if somebody wants to alter their designated property, you, as a Municipal Heritage Committee, have to be consulted by council. If they want to demolish or remove a building or structure on a designated property, both an individual designated property or in a district, heritage district, the MHC has to be consulted by council. Whenever council undertakes a study for a heritage conservation district, the MHC must be consulted. And whenever council enters into a heritage easement agreement, the MHC must be consulted. So the legislation specifically sets out, you must be consulted on these items. There may be other items in a municipal bylaw or in planning documents that deal with consultation, but these are the legislated ones that are set out in the Ontario Heritage Act. You should be aware of the bylaw that establishes your municipal heritage committee. So council has a bylaw that set up your committee, and it would set up the responsibilities of that committee. So it's important you familiarize yourself with that bylaw. You should be aware of the Ontario Heritage Act. It's online. You don't have to print it out, but you should be aware it exists and it has a major impact on heritage conservation. And there are several regulations that go along with that act. And one of the important ones is Regulation 906, which has been recently amended, and that's the criteria for designation. You should be aware of your municipal planning documents, such as the official plan, because it may set out heritage matters that you may have to deal with. There are provincial guidelines and policies. The province published the Ontario Heritage Toolkit. It's now out of date because of all the amendments that have been made in the last 2 years. I hope that it will be updated. It used to be online. It isn't anymore. They took it down because of all the amendments. And there was the intent of provincial staff to update it. So hopefully that will happen. And you should be aware of the provincial policy statement, which they are now going to call the provincial planning statement. It is important, and it is being amended as we speak. You should be aware that there are standards and guidelines dealing with heritage conservation, and these are also online. They're put out by Parks Canada, but Parks Canada consulted with municipal heritage committees, some municipal heritage committees, and some advocates in developing these standards and guidelines. So they set out the best practices for conserving heritage property, particularly if you're altering or adding to that property. So it's something you should be aware of. And it's important when particularly when you're dealing with alterations to heritage properties. And there may be municipal protocols that set out heritage matters. So if there are any specific ones for Innisfil, you should be aware of them. So that's a lot that you should be aware of. You don't have to memorize them all. Just be aware. Almost all of them are online, and you can consult them fairly easily. So what is heritage? What heritage do MHCs deal with? Only properties. And that's an important concept to get across, because what you're dealing with are properties. And as an aside, you may be getting buildings and structures along with those properties, but it's the actual property that you designate. And that's quite clear in the Ontario Heritage Act. So you're dealing with everything on and fixed to that property, including structures, such as the main buildings, the houses, factories, stores, institutions, both the exterior and the interior. Accessory structures such as garages, sheds, gazebos, monuments, bridges, and ruins, they're all structures. and that would include tombstones in a cemetery. The position of those structures on the property. So it's important that that be understood and maybe conveyed at the same time. Ornamental features and fixtures secured to the structure. So I'm showing a picture of a building on the right-hand side. It's a store in St. Mary's, Ontario, that was designated by the municipality. And the owner contested the designation because it included the display cases on the interior. It was a jewelry store when it was first constructed, and it had remained and is still a jewelry store. And he claimed that those fixtures on the inside, because he could take them off the walls, should not be part of the designation process. This went at the time to the Ontario Municipal Board, and the Ontario Municipal Board ruled that they are fixed to the walls, and therefore the municipality may designate them. And that even included the clock that went along with all these fixtures. So it's not very often we deal with interiors, but keep in mind it can include fixtures, but they have to be fixed to the building. It can also include landscape features created by humans, including plantings, such as planting beds, trees, bushes, grassed areas, hard surfaces such as roads, sidewalks, and pathways, and the design or the interrelationship of those features, either with other landscape features or with the structures on the property. So you're dealing with properties. Okay, what properties are of heritage value? And this is where Regulation 906 comes in. And in 2006, it was the first time that the province set out the criteria that have to be used when determining what is of heritage value. And there are 9 criteria, and I'll go through them in the following slides. And they're organized into 3 groups: design or physical value, associative or historical value, and contextual value. And keep in mind, we're dealing with cultural heritage values. Prior to 2005, it was architecture and historical value. The definition has been broadened to be cultural heritage value, and that's an important distinction that was made when the act was amended in 2005. A property must meet, to be listed, it now must meet one of the 9 criteria that I'll talk about. If it's to be designated, it must meet 2 or more of the criteria. Until the start of this year, there were no criteria that a listed property had to meet, and a designated property had to meet only 1 criteria. Anything that has been listed and designated before the act was amended this year, it can continue to be listed and designated, even if it only meets 1 of the criteria. Please note that age by itself is not a criteria for being designated. You can have modern structures that can be of heritage value. They don't have to be old. And that includes landscapes on the property. So let's take a look at the criteria that you're going to be using. And under design or physical value, by the way, at the start of this year, the regulation was amended for the heritage criteria, but all it did was renumber them. So whereas before they were grouped one, and each grouping was 1, 2, 3, they're now 1 through 9. So that's been the only change that's been made to these criteria. So it's a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style or expression or construction method. And here is one that I dealt with in Caledon. And the house that you see there is a vernacular, so it's a local interpretation of the Gothic revival style. And there are many books that you can use to consult about architectural style. There's a few of them. I don't know if any of them are online right now, but certainly there are many books out there that deal with architectural styles, both specifically in Ontario or Canada, or even some of them like the Spotter's Guide that you see down below, which is a world one. You can use that to talk about styles, architectural styles. So it can be architectural style, or it can be a construction method. So here's an example of modernist buildings that are worthy of designation. So this one was constructed in the 1980s, and it's the Roy Thompson Hall in Toronto. And it's an example of modern architecture. And it was one of the few times when I was working at the city that I dealt with an architect who designed a building and the architect was still alive. He was complaining about the reorganization of the seating on the interior. But anyhow, here's another one. This one was done in what, 2008. It's an extremely unique example of deconstructivism architecture. And this is OCAD University, again in Toronto. Very unique structure. And although somebody may say, well, it's modern, why is it of heritage value? Well, 20 years from now, people are going to be looking at that and saying, wow, that is a really unique building and definitely one that is worth saving. So it's raised on pilates. You see those metal things raising the building up, and even the elevator shaft, the escalator shaft coming down from it is exposed. That's that red shaft coming down. And it's a unique situation in that there are 19th century buildings underneath it that are also of heritage value. So there was a case where the university added to the heritage buildings without destroying them. And they added a new heritage building. So that was the first one. The second one is it displays a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit. And again, the same house that you saw before in Caledon met that. And when I looked at the brickwork on this house, I was amazed at the quality of the brickwork. So there we have a building property that meets two of the criteria right away. So clearly it could be designated. The next criteria demonstrates a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. And this one is not too often used. I have used it on bridges, but clearly the lift lock in Peterborough is an example of a very early technical achievement of creating a lift lock. And even though it's owned by the federal government, you can, as a municipality, you can list it in the register. You can't designate it, but you can list it. You can also list provincial properties. So it has direct, the fourth criteria has direct association with a theme, belief, person, event, activity, organization, or institution significant to the community. And this one is Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie. And although it's used as a university. In fact, it was originally built, this part of the university was originally built as a Indian residential school. So they've readapted it, but there actually is a museum in there dealing with its role as a residential school. So that, even though it's not something we think of fondly, I still believe that it's important to save structures like that because they do have a story to tell. And we had our conference up in Sault Ste. Marie a few years ago, and we went out on site to this building, and it really brought home the impact of residential schools. So that's the next criteria. It yields or has the potential to yield information that contributes to an understanding of a community or culture. This building certainly does that. This building and property. There was a graveyard associated with this building, and it was interesting that the clerics who ran this institution had monuments, tombstones, but any of the children that died while they were in the school, there were no markers for them. But nevertheless, the area was set aside as a cemetery. So really, this building tells a great story, not one that we should be proud of, but it's important that we understand what happened. And because this building still exists, that story can be told and you can see visually what it is.
Quick question, Wayne, if I may. Would something like, for example, Upper Canada College in Toronto fall under that designation?
Sure, yeah. Upper Canada College could be designated, yes.
Okay, so anything that can be an like something aside from schools, but something that has a historical aspect that can be traced back and verified, yes?
Sure. I mean, I guess an example of it doesn't have to be a school, but even something that was associated with a traumatic event in society can be a heritage property. So, I mean, you in Germany and Poland, you've got the horrors of Jewish extermination camps. They are preserved. People can go and see them, and the story comes through that. So keep in mind, it can be both positive from an educational standpoint, or it can even be negative. It's something we should learn. I had to deal with the Don Jail in Toronto and preserving that. Not an educational institution, but it was one where I couldn't imagine being in one of those cells. If I put my elbows out on either side, that was the width of the cell that each inmate had. Believe it or not, that was considered aggressive when that building was built. But nevertheless, the building has been converted. It's now part of the administration of the adjacent hospital. But they have kept some of the cells in the building to show what it was like to be in. Oh, they also kept the shadow of the gallows where the last hangings in Canada took place. So I mean, there are all sorts of heritage values associated with the property. They don't always have to be positive. The sixth criteria is it demonstrates or reflects the works of or ideas of an architect, artist, builder, designer, or theorist who is significant to a community. And it's not very often that I dealt with artwork, because usually artwork is removable. But nevertheless, in Toronto, what used to be the O'Keefe Center, I don't know what its name is now, but that is a designated structure. And in the inside is this piece of artwork called the Seven Lively Arts. It's fixed to the wall. And that was an important reason for designating this building. And this artwork was done in I believe it in the late 50s, 1950s by R. York Wilson. So that was a case where it wasn't the architect, it was the artist that was important in getting this building designated. Uh, Certainly the architecture of the building as a modernist piece of architecture was important, but the artwork on the inside was important. The seventh criteria is the property is important in defining, maintaining, or supporting the character of an area. So this was a case in Main Street in Newmarket. And this building, I had to deal with 209 Main Street South in Newmarket and deal with the restoration of the front facade of the building. But this building is obviously important in defining and maintaining and supporting the character. It's linked to the buildings immediately adjacent to it. It's physically linked to them. And even if they're separated by a small distance, this forms a wall of these two-story buildings along Main Street in Newmarket. So that building is important. And it's physically, functionally, visually, historically linked to its surroundings. Again, the same building meets that criteria. It's been there since the late 1860s. It's functionally and physically linked to its surroundings. Again, the same thing. It's connected to the buildings right next to it. So there you have a property that meets two of the criteria on Main Street in Newmarket. Finally, the last criteria is it is the property a landmark. And landmarks can be for various reasons. So in Toronto City Hall, the old City Hall, it's a view terminus. The tower, the building terminates the view up Bay Street. Bay Street does take a bend around the City Hall, but nevertheless, when you're on Bay Street, south of the City Hall, you see this building punctuating the end of the street. Similarly, in Toronto, the Bloor Viaduct or the Prince Edward Viaduct, although you wouldn't know it when you were at street level, when you're down in the valley, it clearly is a landmark. It's a physical structure that you encounter when you're driving along the Don Valley Parkway, and it spans the valley. So that's a prominent landmark. But then you go down to Cobourg and Cobourg City Hall. The City Hall is a landmark simply because it's different from the buildings that surround it. Although it's part of the Main Street in Cobourg, it's clearly a monumental structure, separate and distinct from the others. So those are the criteria that you have to use when you're considering listing or designating a property. So the next thing I want to get onto is council and staff relations. The MHC should communicate to your council. It can do it through a number of ways. It varies depending on the municipality, but it could be a subcommittee of council or through a subcommittee such as planning, or it can report directly to council. Your meetings, your agenda meetings and your minutes should be going to council to let them know. I'm sure you have members of your council sitting on the MHC. Take advantage of them to convey to council what's going on. Direct discussions with councilors. You should be careful about doing this because you should be speaking with one voice. The MHC should be speaking with one voice to your counselors. And then you can also report to council, and then you have municipal staff that you can work through to get your position through the council, because council is the final decision maker on these matters. Staff relations are really important, I've found over the years. Clerk, the clerk is important. The clerk is required to maintain the register, the heritage register. The clerk may provide secretarial duties to the MHC. Planning is important. Even if they aren't directly represented at their meetings, planning applications do have an impact on heritage matters. Your chief building official is important in dealing with alterations and demolitions and associated permits. Maybe your culture and recreation department is involved in that. So there may be others, but at all times, it's important to maintain good relationships with your staff, particularly those that you are dealing with on a frequent basis. Outreach and education. This may be in the bylaw that established you as a committee. One of your programs may be public outreach. Although it's not a requirement under the Ontario Heritage Act. If you are engaging in public outreach and education, the purpose should be to promote knowledge of the community's heritage. And your target audience, heritage property owners, the public and others. I know when I was in Newmarket and chaired the committee there, we held walking tours just to let everybody know that was interested that their community has a great heritage and one worthy of conserving. Your method of delivery, it could be brochures, doors open, digital, seminars. I know one year the Aurora Heritage Committee sponsored a workshop for heritage property owners on good heritage property maintenance. You may have alliances with other organizations, and at all times, and it's important to keep your council informed of your programs and even to involve your council in carrying out those programs. And think about the successes you've had, and if you have failures, learn from those failures. So those would be your lessons learned. So here's an example in Oshawa where they sponsored talks on architectural styles. So, you know, those are the sorts of things you can do. I know when I was in Newmarket on Heritage Day, we had a slideshow, and the community really got interested when they could see slides showing what buildings used to look like and what they look like now, what the street scenes look like and what they look like now. So, you know, there's an opportunity to reach out to the community and develop good relations with them, and again to promote heritage conservation. Here's a case where the Toronto and East York Community Preservation Panel uses digital. They're a subcommittee of the City of Toronto's Heritage Committee. And here it's having your say about heritage within that community. And here are some pictures of walks that have been conducted by heritage committees. Again, people are interested in the community of their heritage, and it's an opportunity for you to convey some of that knowledge to others in the community. Utilizing the local media. Yes, you can use it, but it should be focusing on information issues. And I express you should be very cautious about how you deal with the media, in that your role is an advisor to council. And if you start getting critical of council and the decisions they make before the media, then you are jeopardizing your role with council. So it's really important to keep it positive. There may be other groups that can express concern about things that they think are going wrong, but your role is to try and be positive at all times about heritage conservation. In Newmarket, sorry to keep using Newmarket as an example, but we put up plaques on properties, and it was actually any owner who would agree to have a plaque put up, and it was one that could be read from the street, and it was the first owner, the owner's occupation, and the date when we estimated the building was constructed. Again, it promotes awareness, and you don't have to be present to talk about this. People can just walk down the street and they can see this information conveyed in the plaque. A more formal method, this is the city of Brampton, and they have rather elaborate heritage plaques that they put out with some of their larger heritage properties, talking about the history of the property, maybe showing a map, an old photograph of the property. Again, this is a bit more expensive. You're looking at between $5,000 and $10,000 for this sort of plaque, but it's a great way to convey information about that property. And anybody can stroll by at any time and see that information. Lastly, information brochures. And here's one that you have for your Cookstown Heritage Conservation District. Many municipal heritage committees put out brochures that deal with designation, listing, what are the implications. You can do that on a website, but sometimes it's useful to also have it in a paper copy that you can convey to the property owners. So that's outreach and education. Now it's research of a property that you think may be of heritage value. So keep in mind, when you're researching a property, stay focused. You're looking at heritage values, and you're looking for information that would contribute to meeting those 9 heritage values that I talked about earlier. And the other thing that you're going to be looking at is, what are the heritage attributes of that property? What is it that makes that property heritage? Is it a building? What is on the building that is important? Is it the doors, the windows, that sort of thing? So you're staying focused on those 2 things. It is really easy to get distracted when you're looking at the history of a property and spend a lot of time dealing with the history when really you need to focus on other things, or you've got all the information in your first step. Leave it and move on to other things that you have to do about that. I use a recording sheet that you see on the right hand side when I'm going out at a property, just to tick off the information sources that I'm using, and maybe things that I found out, just minor things that I found out. And when I was working on a property, that was usually the top sheet on a file. I dealt with paper files usually, and that was the top sheet. And I could see very quickly what I had done, what I still had to do, and yeah. So stay organized, use a recording sheet, document your sources, because your findings could be contested. So it's important that if you find something out, document where you found that out. And it's important to understand the historical development of your municipality or community, and to place that property within the context of that development. So I'm going to take an example in Cookstown and walk you through some of the things. This is 4 Wellington Street in Cookstown. And although it is designated by the Heritage Conservation District, I thought it would be a good thing to just see what I find and the various sources that I use. So the first thing you have to do is identify where is the property, and a street address, the legal description, the assessment roll number, and the property identification number are all different ways of identifying the same property. And when you're doing heritage research, you often need all 4 of them. And keep in mind that a street address can change through time. So 4 Wellington Street in Cookstown, there you see the legal description. It's part of Lot 3, north side of Wellington Street, Plan 32, Essex Township, as in that registered plan number. And there's the assessment roll number, and there's the property identification number, the PIN number. And the property identification number is really important when you're going into the registry office. So where can you get this information quickly? Simco Maps is a good source. So for example, the photograph showing the property, the outline of the property. No, my cursor's not working, but anyhow, the one that's just got the building footprints on it, and then the property outline, that's from Simco Maps. And also the aerial photograph on the right-hand side is also from Simco Maps. And from Simco Maps, you can also get the assessment roll number. Now, the clerk's office is also a way of getting the assessment roll number, as the clerk has the assessment roll number that you can look at. And the registry office. The registry office is now online. So it's onland.ca, and you can go in and research the property history of the ownership of that property online. You don't have to go to the registry office anymore. And there's a map on the right-hand side that shows from the registry office the Plan 3, and I've identified it. And there's part of the roll number that you see there, 58141. And the registry office is the point where you start answering the question, who owned the property? And although they may not have lived on the property, it's an important starting point. And it's essential that you understand who owned it. You can go to the registry office online, the abstract index to deeds and mortgages. So that's his historic book that is online. And the Ontario Archives has older microfilm copies of the abstract index to deeds and mortgages books. And the abstract index to deeds and mortgages gives you the index to the deed. So you can actually pull the deed, the mortgage, the quitclaim, whatever, that's associated with that property and has been registered on title. I mentioned the clerk's office for the current assessment roll, and then historic assessment collectors rolls may be available. I didn't have a chance to look in the Ontario archives for Innisfil Township, although this part of Cooksville was in Essa Township originally. But there may be assessment rolls in the Ontario archives that you can consult, and that would help you determine who lived on the property as opposed to who owned the property. And I know I was able to find them for Pickering Township from 1851 to 1950. So in your research, this is what you would find if you were looking in the registry office online. So this is from the abstract index to deeds and mortgages. So it's a historic book. Online, they call them historic books. This one, I had to search a little bit to find Plan 32, because we learned the legal description of it was Plan 32, and it was lot number 3. It was part of lot number 3. And so here you see it, the entry, the first entry, there's a number on the left-hand side, and then the next column it says B and S, which means bargain and sale. And then you've got the date when it occurred, the date when that document was registered, which could be different from when it actually, the event took place. Who granted the property, who bought the property, the grantee, how much, and then the comments there. So you see that this property was originally sold, lot 3 was sold for $160 in 1866. And in 1872, it was sold for $300. So it's possible that something could have been built on the property for $140. May not be likely, but definitely the owner who bought that property. And again, you have to try and read what they've written down there. And I thought it was either Morris or Harris, but I gather it's Norris. Bought the property in 1872 and sold it in 1894 for what, 1,000, no, for natural love and affection, when $1. And then you come down to 1902 when you've got a significant value there of $1,300. So my theory is that it was built at least, it could have been built as early as 1872, but it was definitely built in 1902. And the abstract index to deeds and mortgages gives you the chain of ownership, so you can see who owned it. So for example, for this one, I was able to extract James Evans was the first one who owned it. It was likely vacant. Then in 1872, Margaret and John, I had trouble with it, but it's Norris, probably built it based on increased value in subsequent sales, but I'm not entirely sure. And then David Hooper or Hopper, and both terms are used for the last name. And in 1902, John Banting, and I got down to 1954. So I could have continued it on if I'd wanted to, but I was just looking at the historic ownership. So that's one source of information, and that's your starting point. Who owned the property? If you can get hold of assessment rolls, here's what they look like. And in this case, I can't even remember which township this was for, but it's not Innisfil. but it gives the value and description of the real property. So it gives the value and of the land. It may give the value of the building separate, uh, but what you're looking at is changes in values that may trigger have been triggered by a building activity. Unfortunately, the assessment rolls, historic assessment rolls, don't show whether there was a specific building on the property, except if you can get them for 1851 or earlier. And that's when municipal taxes were based on the building and the number of fireplaces that you had and the number of windows that you had. So there was quite a good description of buildings prior to 1851, but after 1851, it's strictly values that you're dealing with. So it helps you, but it also lists who was living on the property, and that you could confirm whether or not it was the owner who was living on it or they had rented it out. And another source that you can use for who might have been living on the property is the Census of Canada. It is also in line. And this is the type of information that you can get. The census was taken every 10 years back then, and the individual forms are available from 1851 through to 1921, and 1931 should be coming up in a month or two. And it's on the website, so you see the individual sheets where the census taker is recording the information. And it indicates who's living on the property, what their names were, what their ages were, what their occupations were. Sometimes the Census of Agriculture is available, 1851 and 61, and that helps you determine where the property is. And then you go over property location, information, and in the early ones, no, they didn't bother with that because everybody knew everybody and where everybody lived. So you didn't need to put down any addresses except in the Census of Agriculture. And there you can see the lot and concession and the farmer who farmed that lot and concession in 1851 and 61. But in 1901 and 1911, 1921, sometimes there's location information on there. And the important thing is there housing information there, building information? And yes, in some censuses there is. It could be what material the building was built of, the number of stories, even the number of rooms, whether it was inhabited or uninhabited, whether it was under construction, barns and sheds, and it's indexed by the last name. So you can go in and search this by the last name. So if you've got the owner's name, you got the municipality that they were in, you can pull it up. You might be able to pull it up. It may take a bit of searching. So in this case, I pulled it up for the 1921 census, and this was Cookstown, and there you can see very faintly Banting, and his wife and child are living in the house. You can see the red arrow on the sort of right-hand side points to a B, and that's listed under the column building construction material. So it was brick. So that's telling me that there was a brick house. Unfortunately, someone has come along and written over the number of rooms, but sometimes you can, if you blow it up big enough, you can see the number of rooms that were in the building. They've just put a 6 over it. But it would give you the occupation of the person. And it may give you the location, particularly if it's a farm property. So the census is another good source. Maps are really a great source. And here we are looking at 4 Cook Street again, or sorry, 4 Wellington Street in Cookstown. And there was a map done in 1885 of Cookstown. And it was originally done for insurance companies. So they were attempting to assess the fire risk of properties, particularly if an agent wanted to know right away what the potential risk of fire was for the property. So Cookstown was mapped out, and there are maps available for Cookstown in 1885 and 1904 in the Ontario or the Canadian Archives, and they're online. So I pulled this one online from the Archives of Canada website. And there's an 1898 map in the University of Western Ontario Archives. Again, that you would have to pay for to get them to copy it and to email it out to you. There is also, for Innisfil, there's a map of Bellewart in 1936, and also at the University of Western Ontario Archives. That, interestingly enough, is a 4-page map. For those of you in neighboring municipalities such as Bradford, West Gwillimbury, and Newt, Tecumseh, there are lots of property maps, lots of these insurance plan maps, and that's what they're called, insurance plans. And for many of your communities, I know there are a number of them for Alliston and a number for Bradford too, but even smaller communities, they did them for those. But what does this map tell us again about 4 Wellington Street? And there you see a blow up of the map for Wellington Street, the 1885 map. You see the 2022 aerial photograph of the property. And the shape of the house looks almost identical to what's there right now. So I'm going to take a big risk and say that one existed in 1885. So it was probably built in 1872. One thing to note is that it even shows verandas on there. So there's a little dotted line showing 2 verandas, one a small one in the projecting section and one in the interstice between the 2 parts of the house. But it also shows a structure out back. And that structure, there's a structure in 2022 there. So it makes me ask, is that shed out back original to the site? Does it go back to 1885 and earlier? There are other maps that you can use. The historic atlases, which you see on the right-hand side, it's not particularly good for Cookstown. So I put a blue arrow down there showing where the property I'm interested in looking at for Wellington Street is located, but it just shows a blob there. Some of the rural properties, it does show houses on those properties, and it shows who owned the rural property. So that could be useful if you're doing research in what were rural parts of your community. And that's the Simcoe County Historic Atlas. It is also online if you want to pull it up, and it dates from 1881. Historic aerial photographs. So the Simcoe maps that I was referring to earlier has aerial photographs on there going back to 1954, although the 54 one is not very clear. The clearest one is 1978, I believe. So you can see how the property has evolved through aerial photographs. This was one that the province had taken in 1954. and you can see something there. That's as clear as I can get it. But there are clearer ones in the National Air Photo Library, although you have to pay for those. The earliest I could find for Cookstown was 1946, and for Bellure, 1927. So they're a good source, particularly for understanding the landscape that is developed around some of these larger properties. So what do the buildings and landscapes look like now? Google Street View. So this is for Wellington Street. I haven't been out on site, but this is what it looks like using Google Street View. And you're starting to get a bit of history in Google Street View. So I've got a 2009 photograph and a 2015 photograph. And it's interesting that that veranda, the side veranda is still there, although the veranda over the front door is gone. So, you know, it's important to get photographs of the building, but don't go on the site unless you've got the permission of the owner to walk on the site to take photographs. You can get quite a lot from the street, as this shows right here. And the 2009 photograph even shows the garage out back, and it makes me really question whether, you know, that garage may be a heritage structure on the property. And you should note when you're taking photographs, what are the significant landscape features here? And although the fence is there, it's a relatively new feature. And other than that, and the driveway to the side, I don't, and the position of the house relative to the street, with that intervening front yard, those are the significant landscape features on this property. Buildings and interiors. It's interesting. If the building was sold recently, you may be able to get photographs of the interior off the realtor's website. So this was a property I did in Peterborough, and I didn't have to go in the interior, but nevertheless, the realtor's website, the building had been sold a couple of years prior, but the website still had this listing up, and you could see what the interior of this house was like. Again, get the owner's permission if you want to take pictures on the inside. What did the building look like? So this was the oldest photograph that I could find of 4 Wellington Street. And this, I'm estimating, was taken in the 1970s based on the car that's in the driveway. But again, the building hasn't changed that much. But there are sources that you could look at. This one I got from the Innisfil Historical Society, and it was actually a copy of something that the Women's Institute did. They did a survey of properties in Cookstown, and there could be other possibilities for historic photographs of properties that you're dealing with. But it certainly helps you understand how the building has changed or hasn't changed. In this case, it's remained relatively the same. I'm getting several sources now. This photograph, the insurance plan from 1885, showing that the outline of this building hasn't changed since 1885, with the exception of the loss of the little veranda around the front door, whatever it looked like. So those are sources that you could use. And then to answer what style of this, what style is this building? Again, I showed you books earlier about architectural style. There is another one, The Buildings of Canada, which I've copied here. It's also online, although it just deals with 19th century buildings. And this one, for Wellington Street, is a particularly good example of a classical revival style. So it's a vernacular interpretation, but certainly it has some important distinguishing features about it. And that would include the side lights and the flat transom over the front door, the multi-paned double hung sashed windows, the lintel and the sills, the returned eaves. They all speak to many of the classical revival architectural features. So finally, when you're doing research, check for prior what has been done elsewhere on this property. And I had two sources here, the Women's Institute in the 1970s. Again, it was just talking about the owners, and that's when I found out, okay, it was Norris, not Harris or Morris. And it confirmed what I found in the registry office about Banting living there. And then you've got the Cookstown Heritage Conservation District inventory. And this shows for 4 Wellington Street. So it's got the legal description there. Yes, it's residential. It's a house. It's sort of repeated what the Women's Institute said about ownership of it. They called the house a 2-story house. And if I can go back, whoops, no, there. This is not a 2-story house. A 2-story house, the roof would have to be much higher. The roof line is cutting into the 2nd story of this building. So in fact, this is a 1.5-story building. And I believe the insurance plan called this a 1.5 story building. It's brick. If I were to go back to the insurance plan, that showed in that blow up of the property that in fact it you could barely see it, but there was a faint outline of red around the outline of the building, and that indicates that it was brick veneer. If the building was completely red, it would have been a solid brick structure. So again, the cladding has remained the same. So that's the type of research that you can do. And I would stress, keep in mind, you're trying to find out, does it meet any of those heritage values if you're designating a new property? Oh yes, other sources. The Biographical Dictionary of Canadian Architects, it's online. And 2 of them were noted in connection with Cookstown. So you can put in a municipality. In this case, Innisfil just wouldn't pull anything up. So I put in Cookstown. And yes, Edmund Burke designed the Methodist church in town, and Charles Bond did another building. But that's a good source if you can find out who the architect was. That gives a discussion of their works of architects up to 1950. So, you know, that would help you answer the question, is this a significant building? Institutional and business archives, local newspapers are a good source of information, national and provincial archives, and then the Canadian Inventory of Historic Buildings Recorder. This was a manual that was put together in the 1970s when Parks Canada initiated an effort to inventory heritage buildings across Canada. So it was a manual that someone could take out on site and say, okay, I've copied a little bit of it on the right-hand side. What window type am I looking at? And there you see under windows, you've got a single, you've got 2 sash. So this really helps you define the architectural features or the heritage attributes of a property, starting with the basic plan of the building, whether it's an L-shaped plan, all the way through to the type of veranda, the type of foundation, even the type of brickwork, whether it's common bond or Flemish bond. A very good manual online. I would really suggest, if you're going to research a property, you have that access to that to identify these architectural features. So we've done research. We've researched the property. We've said, yes, it meets one of those criteria. We're going to look at listing a property in the Heritage Register. And I put down in the bottom, what does listing do? It provides some protection. It provides a 60-day delay in demolition. And it's an opportunity at that point to decide whether it's worthy of designating. So it gives council 60 days to decide when a demolition application comes in. We allow the demolition, or do we designate the property and deny the demolition? And this is section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act. The clerk keeps the Heritage Register. The clerk may delegate it to others in the municipality. So, for example, in the city of Toronto, was delegated to the chief planner. The register must include all designated properties, and it may include properties not designated but council believes to be of cultural heritage value or interest, and these we refer to as listed properties. And the new legislation has required that the clerk keep this minimum amount of information in the register, and the information must be made available on the municipal website. And the information that you now have to keep in the register is the street address, the legal description of the property, the owner's name and address. So I've just put in, it's as per the 2022 assessment roll. This is not, if you've got, like we had in the city of Toronto, thousands of properties. We're not going to go in every year and add the new owner in. So I've said as per the 2022 assessment roll. So I think that that would accomplish what the legislation requires. And it's just designated properties that you need the owner's name and address. You don't need it for listed property. You need the bylaw number if it was designated, or the date council added the property to the register if it's listed. So I've shown those down below as designated and listed. And then you need to include a statement of the cultural heritage value in the list of heritage attributes. For designated properties, this could be 2 to 3 pages long. And I think to deal with this requirement, simply put in, refer to the bylaw, because the bylaw would have that information in it, rather than trying to put it in the register. Because you're going to end up with a register that's thousands of pages long if you have to include the full statement of cultural heritage value in the list of heritage attributes. You don't need to do it for a listed property, but you do need to do it for a designated property. And again, that's, in my opinion, you're satisfying the new legal requirements for the register. So I mentioned the effect of listing a property in the register, it's a delay in demolition. And it's 60 days notice that council has. It's also a flag to others in the municipality or other agencies that this property may have heritage value. So for example, I had to deal with a road widening and I went to the register and listed properties. Right away, I could see what the municipality was considering to be of potential heritage value to deal with that road widening. So it is an important flag to others. Okay, the listed property, you must include a location description of the property. It could be the street address. It could also be the legal description, lot and concession number. The legislation said, the Ontario Heritage Act says, section 26.0.1, you have to consider prescribed principles. There have been no prescribed principles is set out in regulation. They've now had 2 years to do this. It may not come about, but it's something you can ignore. So don't worry about it. If you go to the legislation and see this, don't worry about it. You don't have to consider it. Council must notify the owner of listing a property within 30 days after inclusion in the register. So this was something new that came in 2022, January 1st, 2022. Prior to that, council didn't have to notify the owner. The notice to the owner must include why the property is of cultural heritage value or interest. So this goes back to those 9 heritage, cultural heritage value criteria that I discussed earlier. So you need to indicate which of those criteria you think it meets. The owner may object to council to listing with reasons for the objection. There is no time limit for an objection and no number of times that an owner may object. The notice to the owner must include a statement of the effect of listing, and that statement simply says, I can say it's a delay in demolition. After filing an objection, so if the owner files an objection, council must decide on continued inclusion in the register and provide notice to the owner within 90 days of council's decision. So that's what the legislation says. But in addition, as mentioned, it has to meet, to be listed, it has to meet one of the 9 criteria. But something new is that all listings expire after 2 years. So it's 2 years after January the 1st of 2023, or 2 years, if you list it after January the 1st, 2023, it's 2 years after that listing date. And you cannot relist that property for 5 years. Don't ask me why the province did that, but that's what the legislation says now. So my suggestion to you is take a look at your listed properties and decide within the next 2 years, now year and a half, whether any of those listed properties should be designated. And I would suggest giving priority to those that you think are significant to the community or under possible threat of demolition. For properties for which the listing expires after this 2 years and are not designated, they could be included in a council recognized heritage inventory, which could be referenced in the municipal official plan. So it's your council giving some value to these in its official plan. But keep in mind that this does not protect against demolition. And your chief building official is required to issue a demolition permit. I believe it's within 10 working days of application being submitted, unless there is a threat to public safety. So 10 days isn't fast enough for council to express its intent to designate. So your experience, who researches listed properties? Is it the MHC? Is it staff? Is it consultants? You sort that out. Who initiates the listing? Any of these could initiate a listing. An MHC could initiate the listing, or council. The public could ask the property be listed, or a planning application on a property that you think may have heritage value, that could initiate a listing. And notify property owners. Who, when required? Well, you now have to notify them at 30 days after the listing. I suggest notifying them before you list. Unless the property is under threat of imminent demolition. The city of Markham will not notify the owner until it has listed the property, because there's a possibility that it could be demolished. My experience has been, if you don't notify the owner before you list, you can get irate owners appearing at council simply because they don't understand what listing means. So I think it's good practice to notify the owner prior to listing. And how do you handle objections? The scope of information, what heritage values are being met is now required. What structures and landscape features are significant? So if we go back to the property at 4 Wellington Street in Cookstown, the house has been identified as being important, but maybe that barn out back has heritage value. There was one there in 1885. Maybe it's the same one. Certainly, the design that I can see from the street suggests that it's quite an old structure, and it may relate to the house itself. So it's important when you're looking at listing properties, what structures are of value, particularly when you get into rural properties. Is it the house? Is it all the outbuildings? Because the owner could come in and ask for demolition. And when the property is listed, any structure on the property the demolition of any structure on the property requires council approval for demolition. And if it's not one that you're really interested in, why drag it out? You can expedite that. So removal from the register, what is the process? Well, the process has now been dictated by the Heritage Act. They're removed after 2 years. Emergencies, how do you handle that? So this is something your Heritage Committee should sort out. How do you handle emergencies if one comes up? And this is an example of a brochure that the town of Ajax put out on dealing with listed properties. So it's maybe one that you might want to put out, although with the fact that listings expire after 2 years, maybe you want to devote your focus to designation rather than adding listed properties. And again, this was an information sheet that was completed by Ajax, actually before the legislation was amended. So this was a property that they were going to list, and on the right-hand side, there are the criteria, and it says well, it says hit and a question mark. So it's saying it met 4 of the criteria for listing. This is also an experience you should be aware of. Ajax did this great and wonderful job. The Municipal Heritage Committee did it, and they took it to the municipal council, their municipal council, just before, a couple of months before the municipal election. And the council said, no, we're not going to deal with it now. So timing is everything about what your municipal council has to deal with. And if you're coming up to an election, don't try and push something like this in front of them unless it is a real emergency. And yeah, here's the cautions. There was a case in the city of Toronto where this Bank of Montreal building at Yonge near St. Clair was demolished before council could express list it or express its intent to designate. And on the right-hand side, you see a report that that Toronto has put forward on listing a property. And they put a statement in there that additional values may be found upon further research. So this is recognizing that listing a property may not be a comprehensive research of the property as you would do for designation. So as mentioned, council must approve this demolition of any structure on a listed property. It cannot delegate it to staff. Council can specify information to accompany demolition application that could include plans, reasons for the demolition, or heritage impact assessment. Council must decide within 60 days notice or the demolition is deemed approved. And that's 60 days from when council is notified, not when the applicant comes in and slaps the application down on the staff's counter. It's actually from the 60 days time starts from when council is notified. So your building official or your planner would have to notify council in a brief report. We've received this demolition application on this listed property. When that report goes to council, that's when the 60 days starts. It's useful to know in advance what structures on the property have heritage value. And I would strongly recommend before someone comes in and does a demolition application that they have a pre-application meeting. So they come in and talk about what they want to do. And it may be that there is a garage or farm outbuilding that has no heritage value, and you may be able to expedite the demolition application if it doesn't involve a heritage structure. So pre-application meetings are really recommended, although you can't require it. If council wishes to refuse the demolition, it must express its intent to designate the property within the 60 days. So within that 60-day notice of that council is notified a demolition application has come in, council has to express its intent to designate the property. So you have to move fairly quickly with the reasons for designation, the list of heritage attributes within that time period. So the Municipal Heritage Committee has to act quickly on this to deal with it. So as mentioned several times, there's expiry after 2 years. But keep in mind, council can express its intent to designate on any property, even ones that have been removed from the registry at any time. So they don't have to be put back on the register in order to designate. If they've been removed and you feel 3 years down the road, that property needs to be designated, council can do it, and the act does not prevent that. That's repeating it again. Properties do not have to be listed for council to express its intent to designate. And as previously mentioned, federal and provincial properties may be listed, but they cannot be designated. So, are people okay to continue on right now? Did you want to take a 5-minute break, or I guess, Kevin, I'm looking to you. What do you think?
Does everybody want a break? I know we've been joined by Mayor Dolan, so Marilyn Dolan from from Innisfil, and we do have Councillor Burkett from Bradford West Glenbury also on our participating tonight too. So appreciate both Councillor Burkett and Mayor Dolan for coming in too. So do people want to have a break, or do you want to keep going? I'm not show of hands, or
I'm capable of going. I'm
Okay, I can keep going, no problem.
sure, let's go.
Okay, so designating a property, this is an individual property. This is part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And the protection is that council can manage change to a property's heritage attributes. And I stress that it's managed change. You're not preventing change, you're managing it to preserve the heritage attributes. So this is OHA sections 29, 30, and 33. Council may designate a property if it meets 2 of the prescribed criteria. So those are the 2 criteria I mentioned earlier, or the 9 criteria I mentioned earlier. Council must consult with its MHC prior to expressing an intent to designate. The intent to designate, once council expresses its intent to designate, that must be sent to the owner, the Ontario Heritage Trust, and published in a local newspaper. And that notice must include the property location, the statement of heritage value and heritage attributes, and that the owner is being given notice, and there's a limit on the time that they must, that anybody must respond to that. If there are no objections, council passes the bylaw. If there are objections, there is now a 2-stage objection process. The first stage kicks in when council expresses its intent to designate. And second, this should be the Ontario Land Tribunal, not the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal. The province has changed the name of this tribunal. So it's the OLT after designation. So there's a 2-stage objection process now. But keep in mind that after council expresses its intent to designate, so as soon as it does that, prior permits permitting alterations or demolition are void, and no owner may alter or demolish affecting the heritage attributes without council's approval. So the property doesn't have to be designated, but this kicks in as soon as council expresses its intent to designate. Again, the legislation says council must consider prescribed principles. Has not been defined in regulation, so you can ignore it. Council may not designate 90 days after a prescribed event. This has been set out in regulation, and generally it's after the submission of a complete planning application. So if there's a planning application that you know of that comes in and there's a heritage property on it, you have to get council to express its intent to designate soon, because the council can't do it 90 days after a complete planning application has been made. The designation bylaw must contain a statement of the cultural heritage value and heritage attributes. It must comply with prescribed requirements and therefore contain the municipal address, the legal description, including the PIN, and the location of the within the municipality. And it must identify the area of the property that has cultural heritage value by site plan, drawing, or description. This is particularly important for large properties. So if it's the farmhouse you're dealing with and the view of the farmhouse from the road, then it could be a limited part of the property. And you may want to set that out in a plan or a drawing. It doesn't have to be a surveyor's plan, but it could be, it could be a drawing and a description that goes with it. For smaller properties, if you identify the property, just say it's the whole property. And you also have to identify which of the criteria are being met. So those 9 criteria I talked about earlier, you have to do that. And that's usually done in what's known as Schedule B to the designation bylaw. Schedule A is usually the location, the legal description of the property. Schedule B is the meat of it. It deals with the heritage values. A description of the heritage attributes and how each attribute contributes to the cultural heritage value. So that's now a prescribed requirement that you have to include that in the designation bylaw. So I'll show you how that can be dealt with a couple of slides from now. But let's deal with the objection and appeal process. So as I mentioned, there's a 2-stage objection process. When council expresses its intent to designate and it publishes notice in the newspaper, the owner has 30 days to object to council. Council has to decide whether or not to continue with the designation or to withdraw it within 90 days. So that's council making the decision. If council doesn't withdraw its notice, it can proceed with the designation bylaw. And it must pass it within 120 days of publication of intent to designate, unless a prescribed circumstance exists. And a prescribed circumstance, it's defined in regulation, but it generally means if there's been an emergency declared by council, if there's a recess, so it's very exceptional circumstances that exist that it has to deal with it in 120 days. If it doesn't deal with it within 120 days, then the whole process stops there and the intent ceases to exist. Council publishes notice of the passing of the bylaw. Now here, the second appeal process kicks in. The owner may appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal within 30 days of the published notice. The Ontario Land Tribunal holds a hearing and it issues the final decision. It can dismiss the appeal and direct the council to repeal the bylaw in whole or in part, or it can say, yeah, the bylaw stands and the property is designated. So it has three options. Repeal the bylaw in whole, repeal the bylaw on part, or the bylaw is approved. So that's what the OLT can do, and it's a legal hearing. So there are usually lawyers there, and they question witnesses as to the heritage value of the property. So for, in terms of your experience, who researches, so understanding that there is an objection process here. Your research on the property has to withstand legal examination should it end up before the Ontario Land Tribunal. And or is it, yeah, the Ontario Planning Tribunal, whatever that tribunal is called now. And it could be who does the research, the MHC staff or consultant. Who initiates designation? Anybody can initiate designation. Your council may have additional notification requirements. Make sure you understand any additional notification requirements that your council has. And who prepares the designation bylaw? Again, you need the legal description, you need the statement of cultural heritage values and the list of heritage attributes. And how you need to work out how you put it forward to council. And you need to work out how you handle emergencies. Your municipal heritage committee should be prepared to meet on an emergency basis should something arise where you need to deal with it quickly. And then appeals, who goes to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So I'll give you an example. Here's a property that I dealt with in the village of Durham in the municipality of West Grey. And this is a Carnegie Library. It was a library up until a couple of years ago when the municipality decided to sell it. And they had to determine whether or not it was worthy of designation. I did an investigation and said, clearly it is worthy of designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. And I recommended that to council along with a designation bylaw. And here is what the Schedule B would look like under the new legislation. And I'm sorry, you'll be able to look at this in more detail when you get a printed copy. But the first paragraph is a description. And here it's saying the property. Maybe I should have put in the words all of the property, but I think that's inferred by saying the property at the street address is worthy of designation. And it's located. So I've indicated generally where it's located on the street. And I've indicated that it meets 6 of the 9 heritage value criteria as prescribed by provincial regulation. And a brief statement saying it was built in 1911 to 12. And it's a one-story institutional building constructed as an area library and meeting room. So that's the first paragraph. Then I get into a statement of cultural heritage values. And that's the next section. So you see design value, associative value, and then contextual value. And I've said under each of them, what value the building is meeting. So for example, the statement says under design value, the Durham Carnegie Free Library, the building, meets the first criteria as a well-preserved representative example of a stone and brick Beaux-Arts classical revival style institutional building in the community of Durham. So I've talked about architectural style, which was the first criterion. The second criteria, I said, the building meets the second criteria as it exhibits a high degree of craftsmanship in the exterior and interior detailing. So I've done that for each of the criteria where it meets, and I've described how it meets those criteria. So I then go into heritage attributes. So what is it that is important about this building? And you have to relate heritage attributes back to the criteria. So rather than do that for each attribute, because you see there are a long list of bullet points, I've said at the beginning, down on the first page at the bottom, each exterior heritage attribute of the property is indicative of the first, second, fourth, and sixth criteria, design and associative value, as they are part of the original building design, while the third heritage attribute also relates to the seventh and eighth criteria. The third heritage attribute being the setback of the building from the street. So in terms of heritage attributes, I've started describing it as a building. So it's a building, a one-story building on a raised basement. The scale, form, height, and massing of the square building on a rectangular shaped lot. The setback of the building. So if the owner wants to move the building at a future date, that's an issue that's a heritage attribute, the existing setback. So they're going to have to come back to council and say, do we have your permission to move this? If I hadn't put setback in there, the owner could theoretically move the building without council's approval. So that's why I've talked a bit about setback. If there had been a bigger front yard, I would have talked about the front yard there. And then I get into architectural details. And you see a long list of them, starting with the basement, the brickwork, the windows, the doors, the roof, the entrance opening. So those are exterior details. Now, you're probably not going to deal with the interior buildings, but I've set out down below the interior heritage attributes. And I've said again, it meets the first, second, fourth, and sixth criteria as they are associated with the design of the building by this architect when it was first constructed. And I had the council question me, why are we including these interior details? And I told them that if you don't include them and they're original to the building, someone could come along, you could sell the building, and the next owner could rip them out, and you would have absolutely no say over what was being torn out of the interior of the building. And some of these are very fine architectural details. And in fact, when buildings like this are converted, they're often converted to law offices, and the lawyers love those details. So the council agreed, yes, okay, we'll include those interior features, and if the new owner comes along, we'll deal with that then. So that's how you can structure your Schedule B of your bylaw to meet the new requirements under the Ontario Heritage Act. But you do have to reference the heritage criteria, how it meets the criteria. You have to list the heritage attributes, and you have to indicate how the heritage attributes meet those heritage values. So you've got an example there you can work with. So that's designating. The property is now designated, and there's an alteration that comes in. Section 33 states that council approval is required to alter heritage attributes. And the legislation now says, or the regulation under the legislation, so this is a new regulation, says that a heritage permit to alter must include the following information and any additional information required by council. And that's the applicant name, address, contact information, the municipality, description of the application, photographs, site plans showing the location of the alteration, drawings of the proposed alterations, reasons for the alteration, and all relevant technical studies, and any additional information that municipal council may require. Sometimes councils require a heritage impact assessment to be that additional information. So that is what a permit to alter now requires. Also, under section 33, council has to issue notice of a complete application within 60 days of commencement. So that's when the council receives the notice of the application. Council must consult with its heritage committee and decide within 90 days of receiving the notice. Council must render a decision even if the application is not complete. And this is an important wrinkle in the legislation. They have to decide even if the application is not complete. I mean, council's decision could be, we're not approving this because the application is not complete, but nevertheless, they have to make that decision or the application is deemed approved. There it is. No decision within the time limits. The application is deemed approved. So council has to act even if the application is not complete. Council may approve with conditions, or it may refuse. Council may delegate its approval authority to municipal employees. And this delegation is often based on if the application to alter conforms to standards and guidelines, which I showed you much earlier in the presentation, which was prepared by Parks Canada. Although it's also normal for council to retain the right to refuse an application if it so decides. Council issues a notice of its decision, or staff on council's behalf, and council may appeal, the applicant may appeal council's decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal within 30 days of the notice of decision. The appeal is referred to the Ontario Land Tribunal, which holds a hearing, issues a decision, dismisses the appeal, or approves the appeal in whole or in part, and so directs municipal council. Again, the OLT has the final say on the application. It is appealed to the OLT. Again, you need to think about municipal experience on dealing with the applications, staff, what municipal heritage, how does the municipal heritage committee get involved? Does your council require anything additional to provincial regulation to accompany an application to alter? Do you have a formal heritage permit process? Has your council delegated approval of alterations to staff? Who prepares the report to council on the application? And have you negotiated conditions on past approvals to alter? Appeals, who goes to the OLT to defend council's decision? And again, I recommend pre-application meeting and to discuss heritage attributes and possible alternatives to minimize adverse heritage impacts. Pre-application meeting is really important in designation that was made by council before 2005. Because prior to that date, the council did not have to list heritage attributes when it is designating. If you've got some of these old designation bylaws, there's no list of heritage attributes in there. So at some point, somebody has to work out, well, what are the heritage attributes if somebody's going to come in and alter? So the best way is, let's meet with the applicant, let's discuss this, let's talk about what we think is of a heritage value, and if necessary, let's talk about alternative ways of meeting what the owner wants to do while minimizing adverse heritage attributes. Really important, and I'm sure Innisfil has some pre-2005 designations. Things to consider when an alteration is occurring. Are the alterations sympathetic to the heritage values of the property? Are they subordinate to the heritage values? Are they compatible to the heritage values? Each of these terms means something different. So, you know, if somebody wants to put an addition to the rear of their property, fine, that may be subordinate. But if it towers above the building, it may not be sympathetic or compatible. So, you know, those are things that you have to consider. Is it compliant with Canadian standards and guidelines for historic buildings? Again, are there options which would achieve the owner's objectives, but be better for the property's heritage values? Are the alterations reversible? Easily reversible. And this is one thing, when I worked at the City of Toronto, paint colors, unless they were painting bricks or stonework, which was prohibited unless they were previously painted, paint colors on woodwork, I didn't care about as a staff person reviewing an application, because someone could also always come along and paint them a different color later on. They're reversible. So, but the city of Markham is very concerned about paint colors, and they actually have a list of approved paint colors that they have for some of their heritage districts. And there may be cases where an alteration restores a documented heritage feature. And so, for example, at 4 Wellington Street, which I researched earlier, there was a little veranda on over the front door. And if you could come across an older photograph showing that veranda, and they wanted to build it, that would be an alteration that would restore a heritage feature. So here's an example of a Part 4 designated property in Georgina. It was a farm property, or it is a farm property. And the proposal was to put a rear addition on the farm property. And it's a corner property, so it's got streets on 2 sides. From one street, the addition is generally behind the heritage building. From the other street, it's very prominent. I was concerned about seeing the heritage building and making sure that from the laneway street, it remained prominent. So the big building, the big addition is in behind it. But I did set out a number of requirements for this alteration, and council can add requirements if the property is going to be altered. One of them was that I required a heritage easement agreement, which is the highest form of protection for heritage property. Council agreed. Council also agreed to amend the designation bylaw to include landscape features. Because the designation bylaw only made reference to the house, but it was the visibility of the house from the street, which you can see in this photograph. It's quite some distance from the street. I wanted to maintain that visibility and the laneway giving access to it, and council agreed. There were also condition issues on the heritage building, identified those condition issues, and the owner was required to post a financial guarantee with the municipality that the owner would resolve those condition issues. And the financial guarantee would be returned back to them once it was verified that those condition issues had been. So council can impose conditions to approval of an alteration of a Part 4 designated. Demolition, so that's alteration. Demolition. Council approval is required for demolition or removal of any structure on a Part 4 property, designated property. So this is why it's important, if the structure is not significant, to identify that clearly from the get-go. The application to demolish is exactly the same as the alteration to approve. The application to demolish is same as an application to alter. So they've got to have all this additional information. All this information you see here, and including any additional information that the municipality may require. And certainly the reasons for demolition are drawings setting out the proposed demolition are important. If this is in a built-up area, you may require plans for the replacement building before the application is approved. So again, there's a process set out here. Council issues a notice that's received a complete application within 30 days of the application served on council. Within 30 days of the notice, council, after the MHC consultation, decides and issues a decision. If the application is not complete, council must decide within 150 days. And it is important that council makes a decision within that 150 days, even if the application is not complete or the application is deemed approved. Again, council cannot delegate demolition to staff, approval of demolition. The applicant may appeal to it should be the Ontario Land Tribunal within 30 days of notice of council's decision. The Ontario Land Tribunal holds a hearing, makes a final decision in an order to municipal council. If demolition is approved, council must consider whether to repeal all or part of the designation bylaw. Again, you need to go through your experience as an MHC, who deals with this, what additional information you may require to accompany an application to demolish. Do you have a formal heritage demolition permit process? Who prepares the report to council? Is it staff? Is it the MHC? Have you negotiated conditions on past approvals to demolish? And who goes to the OLT to defend council's decision? And once again, I recommend pre-application meeting to determine if the structure proposed to be demolished has cultural heritage value. Again, if it doesn't have cultural heritage value, it's one way of expediting the process. Okay, amending or repealing an individual property designation bylaw. Council's approval is required to amend or repeal Part 4 designation bylaw, except to clarify or correct statements of cultural heritage value or list of heritage attributes. The amendment process, there are time limits in the legislation. Council issues a notice to the property owner, consults with its MHC, and the owner may object If council does not withdraw, then it's to the OLT. Repeal process within time limits. Again, it's published in the newspaper. If there, council must consult with its MHC if it's repealing the designation bylaw, and anyone may object. And the appeal goes to the OLT. The OLT holds a hearing and renders a final decision or orders council as appropriate. Okay, so that's individual property designation. And let's look at heritage district designation. And this is part 5 of the act. This is sections 39 to 41. Again, it makes reference to prescribed principles. There are no prescribed principles at this point in time, so you don't need to worry about that. Council may undertake a study of an area for an HCD, and this is recommended, even though the legislation is permissive. Section 40 sub 2 defines the scope of such a study. So you have to look at the area character, the boundary, the objectives in designation, and the context of the HCD, and changes to municipal official plans and bylaws. The Municipal Heritage Committee must be consulted on the HCD study. The municipality may restrict alterations, demolitions, and new buildings in a study area for up to 1 year, and it's subject to appeal to the OLT. And this is not recommended unless there's an emergency, because the municipality could spend all its effort in a hearing before the OLT just defending its decision to restrict alterations for the 1 year period when you want to get the study underway. So again, the municipality may designate an area as an HCD. It must inform the public and have at least 1 public meeting. New. So this is as of January the 1st, 2023. Any new heritage conservation district, at least 25% of the properties in the HCD must meet 2, and that's TWO, of the criteria, the heritage criteria that we've talked about earlier. And it's recognized that not every property in HCD has to have cultural heritage value, although non-heritage properties, the HCD plan would have to have policies to ensure replacement buildings fit into the heritage conservation district. And the Municipal Heritage Committee must be consulted on the designation. So in doing the designation, you have to do the research, and you would have to go through property by property and identify which of the criteria it is meeting. And then you have to make sure that at least 25% of the properties in the area that you want as an HCD meet at least 2 of those criteria. It's the HCD plan and designation is subject to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, and the municipality must have policies in its official plan permitting heritage conservation districts. And that policy can simply be the municipality permits heritage conservation districts anywhere in the municipality. In designating an HCD, the municipality must also adopt an HCD plan. The plan content is defined by the Ontario Heritage Act. So as a minimum, you have to meet a statement of heritage conservation district objectives, a statement of cultural heritage value or interest for the district as a whole, heritage attributes of the HCD and the properties in the HCD. So again, you'd have to indicate for those properties that are of heritage value in the HCD, what are the heritage attributes? There's a policy, you have to have policy statements, guidelines, and procedures for managing change. So that has to be part of the plan. You have to have a list of minor alterations that do not require a heritage permit. And the plan should address public areas, streets, sidewalks, parks, etc. Because when you're designating a heritage conservation district, you're designating all properties within that district, including the streets that form part of that district. The effect, once an HCD is established, a heritage permit is required for exterior alterations, erection, demolition, or removal of any heritage attribute of a property. The municipality may not pass bylaws or undertake works contrary to a heritage conservation district plan. So if your plan sets out that the streets are so wide, such and such a dimension, and there are sidewalks only on one side of the street, the municipality cannot come along and put sidewalks on the other side of the street unless it amends the plan or holds a public meeting and discusses this with the public. So a heritage conservation district does not have to be a big area. You've got one in Cookstown, which is quite a substantial area. Here is an example of Brock Avenue in the municipality of Center Wellington, and it's the Fergus area. And the Heritage Conservation District consists of 6 properties and the street and within that area. And this one is interesting because these houses were all built at the same time with workers from the factory across the street, across the main street, which you can't see, which would be behind you in this photograph, during the Depression, when the factory owner wanted to give work to his employees and he didn't have enough work for the factory, so he had them build these houses. So there's a reason for these houses being there, and the community, the people that live in it, I think it's just wonderful that this little area is a heritage conservation district. Altering a property in a heritage conservation district. Council approval is required to alter a Part 4 designated property and its exterior alterations. And it's an application for heritage permit to alter with plans that's required by council and it's prescribed by regulation. This one, to my knowledge, has not been prescribed by regulation yet, but you might want to check on that. I haven't had an opportunity to look at that, to determine that. It could be the same as a Part 4. The information that's required. Council issues a notice, receipt of a complete application. It must decide within 90 days or alteration deemed approved. No consultation with the Municipal Heritage Committee is required. And the reason being that the Municipal Heritage Committee was consulted when the plan for the Heritage Committee was developed, and that plan sets out what is an approved or consistent alteration, one with the heritage values of the district. So the thinking is you were consulted then, your consultation is not required at this time. Council may approve with conditions, or refuse. The owner may appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, which renders a final decision. Planning policy and application. Okay, your official plan, I'm sure, I haven't had a chance to review it. I'm sure it has heritage policies in there. You should be familiar with those. And maybe if your official plan is under review, you should take a look at those policies and make suggestions to your council if you think there's a need for improvement to those heritage policies. So be aware of those heritage policies, and if necessary, you can suggest improvements to it if you feel they're necessary. Under planning applications come in on heritage properties. And this was one that I was consulted on in the city of Peterborough. And this one was a designated property. And the owner was asking to sever the rear portion of the property. It's on two streets. It's a flanking property. And they required an assessment. It should this be approved. This is something your committee should be looking at. If a designated property comes in and there's a planning application that's submitted on it, you should be looking at the application. In this case, I did a heritage permit, and I felt that the front yard was the landscape that was important to this property. The front yard of the property, which is on the left side, is not being affected by this. And there was enough separation between the house and the lots to be separated that it would not affect the heritage attributes of the house. I also set out conditions for new buildings on those lots to make sure they were far enough back on the new lots from the flanking street so they didn't overwhelm or dominate the heritage structure as you viewed the heritage structure from the flanking or the front street. So you should be aware of applications when they come in designated properties, and you should be prepared to respond quickly to them. And your response could include recommendations for modifications to the application conditions, but any of your recommendations must be based on heritage values. So keep that in mind. And changes of use on a property, if it's going from residential to commercial use, is not a heritage matter unless they're making physical alterations to the structure. Similarly, subdividing a house into 2 units is not a heritage matter. The use of properties is not a heritage matter under the Ontario Heritage Act. Heritage easement agreements. This is section 37 of the Ontario Heritage Act. Council may pass a bylaw for heritage easement agreements. And as I mentioned, these are the strongest instruments that you have in your toolkit for protecting heritage properties. They are entered into with the consent of the owner. And it's usually the consent is given because there's a planning application, there's a grant being made, there's property tax relief, or it's a sale of surplus municipal heritage property. In the city of Toronto, I dealt with these all the time with planning applications that came in. It's placed on title. It runs in perpetuity. And it requires municipal enforcement. So the municipality is the enforcing agent, and any appeals there are to the municipality. It does not go beyond the municipality. So the Ontario Land Tribunal does not get involved in enforcement of heritage easement agreements. Decisions, as I say, the decisions of council are final and there's no appeal. But in establishing a heritage conservation or establishing a heritage easement agreement, entering into one, the Municipal Heritage Committee must be consulted. And the content of the agreement, it includes the reasons for identification. It can include photographs, required maintenance and repair by the owner. So any of the ones I negotiated, there was a clause in there requiring maintenance and maintaining it the property in a state of good repair. It may set out permitted alterations. So these, I dealt with them usually with planning applications. So it would set out what is permitted in terms of an alteration on the property. And there are usually drawings attached to that showing the permitted alterations. The property be insured, and the municipality is a named party to the insurance policy. And that's to ensure that the proceeds, if the property is damaged, the proceeds from the insurance policy are used to restore or reconstruct the structure on the property. It also allows the municipality to reconstruct if the owner fails and to charge the owner, and it places control over signage. And the ones I dealt with allow for possible heritage plaque on the property. That's, you may not want to put that in yours, but anyhow, that's the ones I dealt with. Examples of heritage easement agreements. So Maple Leaf Gardens, you can now go into a Loblaw store there and you can shop at Center Ice if you so wish. But the building and many of the interior features are protected by heritage easement agreement. You know, the house, which I mentioned earlier, there's a heritage easement agreement protecting that one. So that's heritage easement agreements. Heritage property standards. And the effect of this is to ensure maintenance of heritage properties. It's to prevent demolition by neglect. Section 35.3 and 45.1 of the Ontario Heritage Act enable a municipality to have heritage property standards for individually designated properties and for properties designated in heritage conservation districts. And the photographs on the right-hand side are a picture of a building in East Gwillimbury I had to deal with, where it was clearly demolition by neglect. And it resulted in the total demolition of that building. It was beyond repair. So council can set out prescribed minimum standards for the maintenance of the property's heritage attributes, require the property not in compliance be repaired, that but the municipality must have standards, a standards bylaw under the building code already in place to utilize this section of the Ontario Heritage. The municipality does not have to consult with the MHC on this. And indeed, I'll show you, Innisfil has this heritage property standards, but you know, enforcement is continuing issue. And if you believe, if the Municipal Heritage Committee believes that property is not in compliance with the standards, they can advise the bylaw enforcement officer of the property and they can go out and inspect. So yours is bylaw 035-18 and it sets out minimum standards. Section 3 deals with the maintenance and repair of heritage attributes. So if you go into this bylaw, section 3 deals with repair of heritage attributes. So if you're going to replace or repair A building you have on the property, you have to do so in a way that minimizes damage to heritage attributes. When not repairable, you have to replace the heritage attribute in a way which replicates the original. I'm paraphrasing what the bylaw says, but I am quoting here: any portion of a building comprising a heritage property that supports or protects a heritage attribute, such as a foundation, and it goes on to talk about walls, roof, etc., without which the heritage attribute may be at risk of deteriorating or being damaged. Such portions shall be maintained or be structurally repaired and to the property so that it can perform its intended function. I misquoted there, and maintain in a manner that minimizes damage to the heritage attribute. So this gives you the opportunity, if you've defined heritage attributes as doors, windows, but you've neglected to define the building as a whole, this gives the municipality the right to go in and say, okay, for the building that appeared in that earlier photograph, you haven't maintained the roof, even though we haven't defined that. If it collapses, the heritage attributes could be at risk. Therefore, you've got to maintain the roof. So it's quite comprehensive in that way. And section 4 deals with vacant heritage properties and buildings. And here it requires that a property that is vacant for 90 days, utilities must be provided to maintain heating and ventilation. And you might consider saying utilities also for an alarm system to prevent unauthorized entry, because the next section deals with unauthorized entry, and that's boarding up the building, and it talks about boarding it up in an appropriate way, not bricking in windows unless the your chief building officer says that's the way you should go, because bricked in window openings are a problem when you come to open them up later on. So you do have a heritage property standards bylaw, make use of it. Okay, property tax reduction and heritage grants. So this is financial incentives for heritage protection. And the legislation grants is under the OHA, the Heritage Act, Section 39. Which also refers to individual and district grant possibilities. And the Municipal Act also deals with heritage property relief. And under grants, council may provide grants to designate property owners for the cost of alterations. Council can specify the type of appropriate alteration. And property tax reduction, council may reduce property taxes between 10 and 40%. It's council may specify eligibility criteria, and council share or province's share of the cost. The province shares the cost of the education. The municipality does not have to consult with its MHC, but the municipality can suggest examples. You already have property tax reduction, so we can talk about that. In Innisfil, it's a 30% reduction of the municipal and school taxes, subject to the property being designated, and that would be only the historical portion of the property. A heritage easement agreement and annual inspection is required to ensure compliance. There's also a heritage preservation and maintenance agreement set out that the owner has to enter into. The property must not be in tax arrears. And there's a payment of a $50 application fee. And it's limited to existing property owners. So it's not transferable on sale of the property. And it's subject to availability of municipal funding for the program. And it's administered by the municipality in conjunction with the MHC. So presumably you are involved in this when an owner seeks a reduction. Certainly you would be involved because the heritage easement agreement is being sought or required on the property. So heritage grants, there's no program for heritage properties in Innisfil. However, in municipalities, when it is offered, the program requires that the property be designated either Part 4 or Part 5, that the grant is for restoration or stabilization work, that the grant is on a shared cost basis with an upset limit on the amount of the grant. I was up in Penetang, Guichine, a couple of weeks ago, and their upset limit was $5,000, I believe. So that was $5,000 share from the municipality. And the grants are subject to budget limits. Where the applications exceed the budget limit, approved applications are determined based on the nature and quality of the work proposed. So for example, in the city of Toronto, we had a grant program. It was, I believe, roughly $1 million a year. We had grant applications come in well in excess of the $1 million. And we had a committee set up that would review the applications and determine which were the best applications that the city should fund. So that's one way of doing it. Now, although you don't have a grant program specific to all heritage properties in the municipality, you do have a community improvement grant. And this is offered after approval of a community improvement plan. Permitted under the Planning Act and USP and the Innisfil OP. And you do have a community improvement plan in Cookstown, and there are grants there in Cookstown for up to $5,000 for facade building improvement on a shared cost basis. So I presume that would be $5,000 the owner, $5,000 the municipality. That would be the limit of the municipality's contribution. $2,000 for signage improvement, again on a shared cost basis. Any of the work must be consistent with the Cookstown HCD plan, and up to $2,500 for landscaping, property, or parking improvement on a shared cost basis. And up to $5,000 for building code improvements, again on a shared cost basis. In Penetang, Guichine, the community improvement plan, it had higher grant levels for designated properties because they didn't have a heritage conservation district. So it was interesting that that was one way they were dealing with heritage property. And there is a $2,500 for rebate on building and planning application fees. There is also a tax increment grant for major improvements, but it cannot be combined with other grant programs. And I don't know what the value of, what the total dollar value of that would be. It may be subject to negotiation. Anyhow, we have reached the limit, and sorry, I went 9 minutes over the limit, but thank you very much. And I hope it's been useful, and I can take any question.
Thanks, Wayne. Does anyone have any questions?
I just have one thing to say regarding the 1931 census. It came out today online. However, the government website has crashed. Nobody's been able to get back on because it's so overwhelmed. Everybody's excited about that. So yeah, so that's exciting news, but today was the day.
It will be interesting to see whether there's also building information on that census too. I hope there is.
Mhm.
You had it was such a well put out, very comprehensive presentation, Wayne. Lots of information for everybody, especially for our new members and whatnot. But I think Councilor Kate, do you have a question?
Yeah, just on this listing process now, if it's only for 2 years and then you lose the ability to list for 5 years, is there any point in listing anything? Should we just be doing that heritage inventory, and then if required, then if we think something's going to happen, be ready to do a listing? Like, do we just be ready to list?
My suggestion to you is that you should devote your energies now to going through your existing listed properties, identify which ones should be designated, and spend your time preparing the designation bylaws for those, rather than doing new listings, unless you have an emergency and there's a possible threat of imminent demolition on a property. But that's my suggestion. Yeah, it certainly raises the whole question of listing, although I'm old enough that prior to 2005, you couldn't list a property, you could only designate. So we had informal inventories, which we kept under the counter and would haul them out and say, we think your property is significant. If a building permit application came in on it, and we try and meet with the owner to deal with that. But it's a case of, yeah, I think anything that's currently listed, put it on designated. If you think it's really important, spend your time on that. And then the other properties, if they fall off the list in well, it's now a year and a half's time, put them on an inventory that at least the council recognizes the properties as having heritage value. You won't be able to prevent demolition on them, but at least it gives some indication to others that there is of heritage, that those properties do have heritage value.
Right, like if someone wanted to widen the road or something like that.
Yes.
So does council need to pass a bylaw to have this heritage inventory, or is it just something that the committee can do?
I really think it's something that council should do, because it's giving recognition by council that there is some heritage value. If it's just the community that's doing it, it's not council recognizing it, it could be easily dismissed as having no value at all.
Right, okay, thanks.
Mayor Dolan?
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Really interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And I joined late, so if you covered this, I will watch the recording. But the consequences of Bill 23 heritage properties and development?
Oh, they're numerous. I sort of hit through them through the presentation. But Ben mentioned one of them, and that's listing. Bill 23 says listed properties expire after 2 years and you cannot relist them for 5 years. Bill 23 also requires that a designated property must meet 2 of the criteria instead of 1, as before. Bill 23 now requires, if you're doing a heritage conservation district study, 25% of the properties must meet 2 of the heritage criteria. Before, there was that requirement did not exist. So Bill 23 has a major impact on municipalities, and it's the biggest impact is on listing of properties, because your municipality may have 50 or so. In the city of Toronto, there were thousands of listed properties. They hadn't been designated, but there are thousands. So they're wrestling with how do we deal with this issue, because they're going to expire in a year and a half's time. And I know the city of Markham, their staff is spending all their time going through the listed properties and moving all of those to designation. That's where all their staff time is being spent right now. They're designating 6 to 8 properties every meeting just to try and get through their listed properties. So yeah, Bill 23 has had a major impact on heritage.
Can I just, sorry, follow up? So there was an issue, I thought, unless I heard it wrong, that are kind of affordable, how if there was a designated heritage property that could be affordable housing, that somehow affordable housing would trump heritage.
No, I'm sorry, I haven't seen that anywhere. What is happening is all these amendments to the Ontario Heritage Act dealing with listing in that, they're all appearing under Bill 23, which is more affordable housing. So the justification is being affordable housing, but frankly, I don't see how the change in listing affects affordable housing. In fact, I've dealt with many heritage properties where they're being converted to housing when it was a factory, or and there was no housing in it, or it was a school and there's now housing going in it. So I mean, I don't see heritage as being an impediment for affordable housing, but unfortunately, the government disagrees with me.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone with any further questions? Oh, Deputy Mayor Fowler?
Thank you, Wayne, for that incredibly thorough amount of information, which is going to take most of the night to process. Just so you are aware, we've been doing this sort of work ourselves. Once we found out what Bill 25 was bringing to the table, or Bill 23 is bringing to the table, we've started triaging, and we're looking at everything what we can do with when it comes to future construction, where it's going to be located, how it's going to be done. So, I mean, this is something we're looking at in every angle possible, and we're trying to learn from a few other cities, like you brought up Coburg, another one is Markham. So we're discussing options. We're not committing to options, but we're discussing options and trying to find out what we can do to move things along in a timely fashion. But at the same time, due to our limited manpower and the number of homes we're going through, we have to prioritize. But I understand what you mean. It's incredibly difficult. But this tonight, a lot to take in. So, and a big thank you to Kevin for following up with the notes for everybody. So that'll be greatly appreciated, because it gives us time to go over and then refresh as time progresses.
if I could just add, you're certainly welcome to come to the conference in London, because there will be other municipalities there, and several panel sessions are dealing with how do we cope with the implications of Bill 23. So certainly other municipalities will be expressing how they're trying to deal with it. And it's a case of trying to deal with it as best they can with limited staff resources.
Guess we'll go one final call for questions from anybody. If anybody has any questions. We'll see none. Wayne, just on behalf of the Innisfil Heritage Committee and certainly with our friends from Bradford, West Gwillimbury and Newtecombe Heritage Committees, thank you so much for taking the time tonight. I know you're very busy as president of CHO. I know with the conference in the next couple of weeks in London, you probably got a lot of things on your plate, but thank you so much tonight for taking the time to go through heritage preservation, and certainly the impacts of Bill 23. It's something that I think all of us who are on heritage committees and even our members of council are going to be dealing with for at least for the next little while. So much appreciated for taking the time. I will be providing, you will be sending me a copy of your PowerPoint presentation. So I will be sending that out to all anyone who registered to attend tonight. And also this meeting's being recorded, so I'll also make that available, and also to you too, to the CHO if you want to post on your website too. But anyway, Wayne, once again, thanks so much for taking the time. Very much appreciated.
You're welcome, and good night.
Good night, and
Thank
good
you.
luck, and best wishes for a conference too as well.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
All right.
Right.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, Blaine.
Thank you.